All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Rodney Matthews. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I am a career advisor that works here at the Career Center at Loyola University, Chicago. And thank you all for joining us for our first diversity panel of the series, focusing on identity in the job search. So today we have three great panelists who are taking the time to talk with us this afternoon about their experiences as it relates to the job search. So I am gonna go ahead and let them introduce themselves. I'll just kind of go in the order that I see you all. So Lolan.
Hello, good evening, good late afternoon, everyone. My name is Lolan Adan. I am a graduate of the Institute of Pastoral Studies, May 2020. I am a career changer, so my pursuit of that degree in Master of Arts in Pastoral Counseling is a second sort of career pursuit. I spent 23 years in Wall Street as a sales trader, banker, finance person across many different banks. And when I discerned to do something different, I decided to go into counseling and therapy. So I pursued the degree at Loyola. I got licensed with a licensed professional counselor status this past year, and I'm working towards an LCPC, which is the full licensed clinical pastoral professional counselor. And I'm currently working in a private practice downtown that has offices, I think Chicago had about 6 offices, the Center for Personal Development, as a staff therapist. And I'm in my 4th or 5th month, and I think as of the last couple of weeks, I've probably hit my targets in terms of client roster. And so it's going very, very well, and I'm learning a lot still, and I'm happy to be with you guys today.
Thank you so much. And then Lorenz.
Hi, y'all. My name is Lorenz, or now I go by LG Jones. I graduated with a degree in political science from Loyola, also in May of 2020. I am currently, my pronouns are he, him, his. I am currently a law student, and I've spent the last couple of summers interning in labor and employment law, specifically labor and employment litigation. And soon I will be venturing back to Chicago, as I'm currently in New Orleans, to do full-time labor litigation with Proscar Roads in the city.
Thank you for joining us. And Paulina.
Yeah, that leaves it to me. But yeah, hey everyone, my name is Paulina. I'm really excited to be here. I graduated Loyola May of 2021, so hasn't even been a full year yet. But I graduated from the Loyola School of Environmental Sustainability with a BA in Environmental Studies. And October 1st is when I started working at CNT. That's my current role. I'm a project associate. And CNT stands for the Center for Neighborhood Technology, and I'm on the Urban Resilience team. So we do a lot of work kind of bridging social equity and environmental justice and sustainability.
Thank you, Paulina. So before we get started, I did want to read our land acknowledgement here at Loyola, because that is very important that we are on land that belongs to someone else. So Loyola University Chicago community acknowledges its location on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi tribes, and a place of trade for other tribes, including the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Potawatomi, Sauk, and Musaki. We recognize the descendants of these and other North American tribes continue to live and work on the land with us. We recognize the tragic legacy of colonialization, genocide, and oppression that still impacts Native Americans today. As a Jesuit university, we affirm our commitment to issues of social responsibility and justice. We further recognize our responsibility to understand, teach, and respect past and present realities of local Native Americans and continue this connection to the land. So today we are going to talk about job identity as it relates to the job search. So identity as it relates to the job search. So a lot of times when we go to work, we bring our entire self. And I think it is really important to think about how that plays out in the job search, because that is something that is very important to us when we are looking at a place to work where we feel like we're valued and appreciated and that we can truly bring our authentic self to work. That's not going to be the case, and it's probably not going to be the best fit, or a person is not going to be happily employed at that job. So in regards to thinking about that, I wanted to pose a few questions, but in addition to that, I am going to keep the floor open as well. If anyone does have an additional question that they want to add in, please type in the chat and we will make sure that those questions get addressed, time permitting. So my first question for the panelists, how have you experienced your own identities as they relate to the job search? So looking at some of the dynamics that may have played out with your respective searches as you were looking for opportunities, whether that's internship or full-time job, how do you feel your identities were incorporated into that search?
Okay, I'll go ahead and answer that one first. So it was a little more difficult for me because I didn't know exactly what it is that I wanted to do. But I know that whatever organization that it was, that I definitely wanted to have staff that was reflective of like the real world diversity that I see every day around me. So before applying to a job, I would make sure that I would go on their website, and not only that, like that they would have like diversity, equity, and inclusion values in their mission, but just to see that reflected in the staff, ideally, even like to the top level leader, even like the CEO. And I didn't see that in even most cases, and even my organization now, I do see that reflected in most of the staff, including myself, but it's still like a white CEO. But those are still conversations that we have, and we acknowledge that fairly often. But yeah, that's how I've kind of had my identity into the job search. So I just wanted to make sure that the job was reflective of my values, because I do identify as just Mexican American. That's like a nationality. Racially, I'm always confused when I go on, like, you hit the box, it's like, am I white? Like yes and no. Like I am I'm brown, but also very, light skin. So it's, racially speaking, I don't tend to kind of go off of that for my own identity. I definitely do take my identity more onto like my ethnicity. That's kind of how I carried it into how I looked at jobs initially.
Thank you, Paulina.
I'll have a stab. So for me, I'm 51, so with my career change, I needed to make sure that I wanted to make sure that I also was recognized as having had a different identity or different pursuit of work prior to my sort of counseling therapy identity. So in other words, a place that would reward me for like all of life experience, not just sort of one part of me. And so a place that had sort of elderly or older clinicians, a place that also looked at other older populations to serve was important. I also was very cognizant of a pastoral counseling degree and how that could be a little bit tricky to present to a fairly secular organization, because the place that I'm at now, and I wanted to do this on the get-go after my residency and internship, was to go to a more secular place. So the word pastoral, people would look at me going, what does that mean? And they immediately thought it was like a religious degree, a divinity degree. And so I was already faced with all the assumptions that go with that. So I needed to make sure that the place I was going to go into was going to be an open place to have room for all. I'm very aware that religion, faith, spirituality can both heal people and have healed people, but can also hurt and traumatize people. So it's both sides of the equation. So I have to be very careful around how I present that. And at the end of the day, for me as a clinician, it all comes down to the client. The client is what dictates my view. But I wanted to make sure a place that I was going to go into would have an open mind around a pastoral character. And they did prove that. The first couple of meetings, they already showed up and said, we don't often talk about spirituality and faith in our, sources of strength for our clients. Can you say a little bit about that, Lolan? Our new clinicians, like, yes, absolutely, right. And then the third part for me that was important to also be fully myself was, I identify as a gay male, and so I I had very open conversations around that part of identity and how that was welcomed in my practice, the processing groups that were in place for that population. So, it sort of struck a chord that it would be a faith, spirituality lens, sort of a sexual identity lens, and also sort of an age lens, if you want to add to that. And then also the backstory too of just being a Filipino American immigrant. So intersectionality all across the board and how that shows up in the workplace and how people navigate those intersections of possible challenges or triumphs. And so far, knock on wood, the place that I'm at seems to be holding up to its values of belonging and community and inclusion and diversity. So I'll be there for a little bit, as long as I can do my job well.
Yeah. So before answering that, I think it's important for me to acknowledge my salient and non-salient identities. I'm very much a Black man, and I appear in every space as a Black man. I also try to appear in every space as someone who came from a very low income background. And that plays out a lot in my interviews, where especially now entering the field of law, where you'll learn that a lot of people when they're that you're interviewing against have been in families of attorneys for generations and have a very much more concrete view of the field, as I'm kind of learning as I go, as a first generation lawyer in my family. And one of my most prominent non-salient identities is identify as a queer man. And that's something that's been new to me, is I learned that about myself, where I've been dealing with that since 2019. And when I was trying to kind of get into exploring that more, COVID started, and it's something that, though it is important to me and important to my acknowledgement, I've noticed that in terms of my job search, I don't necessarily go out and say, oh yeah, I'm pursuing this job as a queer man in this space, for a number of reasons. And I don't think I have a full answer why, but I think that's important to acknowledge, is that I have identities that when I do go out, I push, and I want to make sure that the place values versus identities that I have, and I take into an opinion, and it affects my opinion, but I don't necessarily push and don't have conversations about. Now, that said, we all know, or we all should know at this point, that law is a historically wealthy, white, male space. And it has been that way for a long time. So for me, it was going to be hard to find a firm, especially for the type of law I want to do, which the type of law I found, I would say more, which is corporate labor and employment law. You'll find that it was going to be difficult for me to find diversity throughout the firm. So what I looked for in my process it was, how committed are you? What are you saying you're going to do, and who are you hiring to make sure that happens, and what positions are you putting them in? If you're head of HR is a white man, and y'all have hired a slew of Black and brown and queer associates, but there's no associates in the firm that over 5 years have been there for 5 years, you can tell that there's a culture there that isn't sustainable. They're trying something new, and they're doing something new, but it's not happening from top down. So I looked for, okay, are you putting like Paulina said, the firm I ended up with, their managing partner in their office is a Black man. And that was the conversation I had in my initial interview, was, how does appearing as a Black man affect you in this space? And he talked about it, and he talked about his goals long-term for the firm, and that made me more comfortable with my process. Choosing a firm like that, they've hired people in HR who are Black people and queer people who are not just going to hold up the status quo, and who have been doing it for long enough where I can trust that they're going to look for long-term change. Now, it's hard for me to say if it's going to take or not, because again, I think with law, it is historically what it is, and we only can judge by what's in front of our faces, because they might just be reacting to the events of 2020, or the events that have been kind of what we're calling the events of 2020, and then be willing to just go back to what they were doing before, once that conversation quiets down, which is a tough realization to have.
Thank you all for sharing. And I think the next question kind of alludes to some of the things that you all have talked about so far, but when you're thinking about your identities and how that's represented as a part of the job search and the disclosure that might go along with that, how do you feel that plays out in your searches or the search that you currently partook when you kind of think about things related to interview questions that may come up, or things around external appearance, or how you're listing out different experiences on your resume that may allow you to disclose certain elements of your job search?
I can start. So I think there's two things you'll notice with legal job searches is that a lot of firms have diversity statements, which are excellent opportunities for you to disclose who you are and your experiences. But there are more sections of law just than corporate law. And when I started applying to opportunities, I also didn't know what I wanted to do necessarily. So I didn't start with corporate fields. I started with a lot of public interest fields. And a lot of times when you do public interest work, you'll have opportunities on either side of the aisle, as they would say. Like if you want to be a public defender, there are DA opportunities that like you're going to get sent, and you, as a 1L student, you're expected to send out as many applications as possible. And with that, I quickly learned how unwilling people in certain groups, specifically like DA's offices, were unwilling to have an active conversation about criminal law and race. I'm sure as we have known and learned and experienced that there is no way you can talk about the law and the letter of the law without talking about race, and how that plays into the way policing has been done in the country for generations. And that let me know early on that I don't know if I can do this, because if I'm expected to talk about law in these groups without being able to say, well, this person is, a low-income Black woman, she's had X, Y, and Z experiences, like, I don't know if our course of action is the best, because it's just going to create the cycle, because they're only looking to solve short-term problems. And that was one of the biggest interactions with, race with the employers. I will say from my side, I've always seen my race and my marginalized identities as a weapon. This is something I talked about in one of my interviews that people found super interesting. It's something I like to tell people about. So I'm going to tell this quick story of how I decide which wallet to buy. When most people go and buy wallets, especially like it's a wallet, it's not that big of a deal. You just need something to carry your card, your money, and your ID. They grab whatever one looks nice and they get out of there. Since I was about 13 years old, have always sat there, and buying wallets has been a big decision for me because of my fear that one day my wallet's going to be seen as a gun. And that is something so small that people won't think about necessarily, but it matters to me. So I never have bought a black wallet in my life. I've never owned a black wallet. If someone gifts me a black wallet, I will give it back to them because I'm not going to keep it. I'm not going to use it. I typically buy brown wallets and all these other things. And it seems like that's such a small detail about life that you don't think about. But as marginalized peoples, that's something that we have to think about. That gives us a greater attention to detail, which is important in the field of law. And you don't think about it that way, but there are things you do throughout your daily life that a lot of white students are not going to be doing. A lot of students who don't carry marginalized identities are not going to be doing that you are. That allows you the gift of just a crazy attention to detail and a crazy ability to multitask that most people won't call multitasking, but it is. And though you're not able to turn it off and know it hurts sometimes to have to do that, that's a skill and a power. And I make sure to share it. And I make sure to share it in a way that says I'm proud of the fact that I can do this and I know how to do this, because if this comes across someone else's desk, they're going to miss details this small because they haven't lived their entire lives practicing attention to detail at the level I have.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, LD. So in my experience in kind of disclosing my identity, the first thing that I would just do obviously is just go on the company website or the organizational website. And again, I am in the nonprofit world where I do feel that's very different from maybe being in the law world or, physical therapy or anything like that. But yeah, because in the nonprofit world, I feel, at least in my experience, that it's a lot more open in having those conversations pretty much every day. And like even hearing you say, Rodney, that perhaps in the job field, like you might expect to not have those conversations on the daily or to work with majority white people, but I feel very lucky to be in a space where it's like I see that reflected all around me pretty much. But yes, the first step is just like looking at the website, seeing if it's reflected in like the organization's like mission and values. And that's a good first step. But again, like it could just be a facade. And there's no way to know that immediately, but we can get into that later. But also like asking like interview questions when you're in the interview, like don't be afraid to be bold, because first of all, like people like seeing that. Like if you ask the question like how can you assure me that I won't be tokenized for being in this space, and just see how they react to that, see if they have anything to say, and they should have something to say, and to make sure that you're not just going to be there just to fill some sort of quota, and that you're really there because they value just the whole you and not just like several identities that you present yourself to be. But yeah, interview questions, looking at the website, that's kind of the main thing that I've done when disclosing my identities in my job search.
Thank you, Paulina.
I mean, one of the things I sort of to express my identity is I worked with Catherine Archer at the Career Services place in Water Tower campus in streamlining my resume from all those decades of work and then making it work into the mental health counseling, mental health therapy space, and being very intentional around which words and bullet points to keep from my old jobs that highlight certain experience sets that I have, and even sort of life experience that I've got. So I wanted to make sure that the receiving end of that would know certain things about, you know, my background, my values, my focus. But really, at the end of the day, I also wanted to make sure that I honored my end of being a young clinician, and that I was going to walk into a place that was going to help continue my formation as a clinician. And so I wanted to make sure that I had certain people that would always be there for me in terms of supervision and things like that, and that those supervisors are able to work with a whole variety of different clinical presentations and different clinicians. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I also had to look a little bit more specifically around me and what they can do for me, right? Because I think a lot of the time, I know what I can do, and I certainly do that equation, but in the beginning stages of something new, I want to make sure I'm getting best practices across the board. And so the things that I wanted in terms of attention to detail and honoring my culture and multicultural discussions around sitting with different clients, that the people that were going to supervise me in that role, because there is a very much a one-on-one hand-holding role bit for young therapists, that they were going to be there for me and that they would appreciate that part of me. And, you know, I also did, like, you know, sort of Paulina did around the websites and the staff and looking at bios and things like that. And, you know, that gave me some comfort, but I also knew that at some level in the pandemic world that we're at, where everything is on a technology platform and not in person, I'm not meeting these staff members and colleagues in a water cooler chat in person, and I'm not relating them in that way. I'm relating them in this way. And so far, what I've seen is a very, very open discussion around very tricky topics that come up because our clients bring them up. And so they're not afraid to talk about that stuff. And then there's further opportunities for further supervision in case things get a little bit tricky and language gets a little bit tricky. But I knew on the get-go that I wanted to make sure certain parts of my identity were included on paper that they could always look at and see. And then much like LD, the stories that I would relay when I did have that interview, that I would say things like, you know, when I moved to this country, you know, from the Philippines back in blah, blah, blah. And I'm looking at a very young person in front of me and I'm like, yeah, like I'm twice your age. And you know, what are you gonna do about that kind of thing, right? And so, but not hold back that story and making sure that I'm still continuing a thread of, at the end of the day, I'm here because I gave myself permission to do something differently. And that's what people do in the therapy space, is they're giving themselves permission to do something differently. And are you going to be an accompanying character in that journey, or are you not going to be an accompanying character? And so you can suss these things out pretty quickly. I really do think that you can get a sense of people. But much like sort of LD's point of own it, like own it, don't hide from it, because you want to be fully you when you're there. And also understand that the fully you at 51, which is I'm at now, was very different from the fully you version of what I was at 21. So there's room for growth still, like there's still so much room for growth. So even when you say you're trying to be fully you now, you can own that, but know that there's still more ahead of you in a really, really good way.
Definitely. Thank you all so much for sharing such deep insight and just guidance around some of these topics, because they are hard to talk about sometimes when we think about how we show up at work and how much we're willing to share about ourselves with who we are working around day to day. My next question touches a bit on that. So as you're thinking about how you go to work every day, how have you navigated feelings of isolation and just a lack of representation in the workplace that may look a lot different than college? Thinking about how in college you do have a little bit more choice and agency about where you spend your free time or how you're involved with extracurricular activities. Work may look a little bit different from that for a lot of people.
I feel like I can't fully answer this question because, again, I'm just really fortunate to be in a space where regardless of age, because I'm the youngest person there, but it is pretty much like college. Like I do see a lot of diversity in age, in ethnicity. It's like, for example, a coworker, like she just got her green card and she's been working on that for, I can't even tell you how long. And then we all celebrated that in a Zoom call. Like the fact that we were able to do that was just awesome. So things like that happen pretty frequently, constant conversations that we have. And yeah, so I don't know, again, if I can fully answer that question, but again, just lucky to be in that space.
Yeah, Paulina, it sounds like you ended up in a nice environment.
Yeah, I'm really, again, just really lucky and so grateful. Really am.
It's an interesting question for therapists because it's a very isolated lifestyle in many ways. Even if you're in a group practice or a community health center, you all have your little rooms of privacy. So you really do stay within the boundaries of your space with your client. So it is a little bit more of a one-on-one situation. And when you do go out in the common spaces to commune with your colleagues, which I haven't done because I've started this job completely offline, it's very much sort of like a 5-minute space, and then you go back into your room and then you see your client. So the way I would answer that is more along the lines of, does the practice make room for diverse content to come to us? And how do we do it as clinicians? How do we how do we sit with and process with clients that bring a whole load of different topics to us? And it's a reverse question in many ways, because as a clinician, you have your identity, but you really have your boundaries around what the client's stuff is and what your stuff is. So you have to be very clear around where you begin and the client begins, because it's all in service of the client, right? But then you're not a blank piece of paper. You come with a lot of rich history of life. And what I look to in my communal meetings and supervision with colleagues is how they're able to leverage their richness for their clients' service, not for our service and for each other really, but it's really for the client, but how we can handle that as clinicians. And as far as I can tell, yes, there's a little less older clinicians that skew a little older, so it's a little bit younger. That's a little tricky. And what I sit is I always make sure to inject the viewpoint of a middle-aged person or even elderly, above middle-aged person, to say, I see what you're saying, but this could all be a different perspective, right? And I want to make sure that it's balanced. And then the other thing I would say is the injection of meaning making with a comfort around religion and spirituality. If that's looked upon not so much favorably, but with an open mind, again, because not everyone has a very positive view of that aspect of people's identities. But I definitely want to be held in a place where openness to discussion and growth and curiosity is paramount versus the evaluation of how he or she does, their value system.
Rodney, can you say the question one more time, if you don't mind?
Sure. So when you're thinking about how you've navigated feelings of isolation or a lack of representation in the workplace around just diversity and maybe people who have different identities, which may have looked a lot different from college in some contexts.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm trying to figure out where to start with that question. That's a really good question. For me, I think the first thing I noticed was, especially as a Black student on Loyola's campus, which I don't know what the campus is like nowadays with COVID. So I don't know how many people share this experience, but we had BCC, and not just like having the organization, but having a room. Because whenever something happened to me on campus that I felt like annoyed or microaggressed or macroaggressed or anything, the first thing I did was went to BCC, and I had a community that I could lean into who either had direct knowledge or indirect knowledge of what happened, and they could help me through it. And that is something that I think I honestly took for granted in college. That ability to have a circle of people who share your identities and know your experience enough to support you in a very, very in-depth way with different perspectives was amazing. That doesn't exist in the workplace. And what I found is, though I can still have a community and still have people I can talk to about things, there's less of an ability. You kind of have to sit on things more. You have to work with people's schedules. Like I had something happen last summer. I had something happen with me with another like senior associate that just bothered me. And it wasn't that she said anything terrible. It was just like, you didn't need to say what you said. And it wasn't important enough for me to send to HR because it just wasn't worth it. But where I would just go to BCC and scream about it, I had to sit and wait till I could get on someone's schedule and have a very scheduled 30-minute conversation about microaggressions in the workplace and the best way to handle them. And that's different. And when you don't have that community, which you can put yourself doing, especially if you're having a hard time finding time to meet with your friends or whatever, is isolating yourself and nitpicking yourself and start blaming yourself for something other people says. And that doesn't need to be that way. I suggest people go to therapy. I suggest people write things down because that helped. And the biggest thing we do in law is I think we call it a board, where you take different people from different perspectives, and whenever you have a problem, they're the first ones you go to and you ask them for help, whether they're your age or been in law for 30 years or whatever. Like, they're kind of there to help support you throughout your process. And that's what I find myself doing, is when I have moments like that, I might text someone in the media and say, hey, like, this just happened. Do you have time next week to talk about it? And, I just have to kind of compartmentalize it a little more and say, that doesn't affect my day-to-day life. That doesn't affect my paycheck. That doesn't affect, the workload I have. It just happened. And I do need to talk about it and do need to deal with it, but I need to be in the space still, and still need to be the best version of me and still be the Black Lorenz that they hired. And not afraid to do that because someone said something they shouldn't have said.
Yeah, thank you all again for sharing such deep insight around some of these sensitive topics that I think we all encounter at some point in our working lives as just diverse professionals. And my next question follows a similar theme, but thinking about yourself now and who you are, what do you know about yourself now as it relates to the job search and your identities? that you wish you would have known as you were completing college? And I know for some of you, you aren't as far removed from college just yet. So as you think about that, what are maybe some things that you would have done differently or just you're aware of now that you would share out if you had to go through this process again?
Really good question. Oh, yeah.
You go first.
Okay. Well, I was just kind of like thinking out loud, but I mean, if you have something more, I can think on it more. If you have something more solid to say.
I think it's no one is expecting perfection. No one is expecting like the perfect candidate, the like perfect version of whoever you think you are. And for you to have everything figured out, especially as a young person in your field, and to lean into that, to say like, I'm here to learn, right? Like this is my first stop, and like I plan on being, for me it was, I would say this is my first stop, and I plan on being an attorney for 30, 40 years. Like I am moldable. So, and that's in a way they like that, because whatever you produce, you're not gonna, whatever they want you to produce, you're not gonna fight back in terms of, like, well, for the last X amount of years, I've been doing it this way, like, and I think it's better for this reason. I can just say like, okay, I've never made this before, but if you like it made this way, I'll make it this way. And I'll have that fight with the next place I work at. That's something I wish I knew, because I feel like, especially early on in the process, I guess we'll talk about this when we talk about imposter syndrome. I would not apply or not do something because I'm like, I'm not good enough for this. I'm not worthy enough. And I took myself out of a lot of application processes and opportunities because I didn't believe in myself enough, because I thought they needed someone more perfect than what I had to offer. And that wasn't true. And because I reached out and because I did, aim higher than I thought I could, I ended up working at having one of the best jobs you can get as a 1L in law,
I think I would, looking back, I was such a serious young person, and I was very determined. I mean, I remember being very obsessive around detail and making sure that I hit my points. And, I would walk away from interviews thinking, oh, I didn't talk about this and that, right? Like you have your list of things that you wanted to bring up, like the wallet story. I mean, that's like, these are things that are, I mean, I'll remember that story forever, right? These are the things you want to leave threads of life with people, right? Just that energy, right? I think I look back and I want to say an injection of just a little bit more joy or lightheartedness around the enterprise of an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to keep getting better, and sort of not using the language of it's a challenge and we're looking forward to it, but it's more like it's going to be fun. Like it's new. And I look back and I feel like I could have been a little bit more just like I could have taken that breath a little bit more, and these days I take a lot more breaths because I'm like, and I have the experience of hindsight. I can kind of look back and be a little bit more forgiving. But the fun you, like that fun you is also part of you. And I think I would have been nice if I had sort of communicated that a little bit more. I mean, that would come out anyway, but why not start from the get-go? Like, you're going to get this too, right? And by reflection, you also get the sense of what does that look like for you, Mr., Mrs., Ms., like Chanel suit person or whatever you're wearing. What does that look like for you, right? Because at the end of the day, sure, I want to sit with the best, learn from the best, but I really just want to sit with like good people who are going to own my development as a young professional and be good about it and be good stewards and caretakers of me, right? Of me. And that comes down to a little bit of like the the person, the soul, rather than the intellect and the mind, right?
So honestly, before even giving myself advice, like I would just give myself a hug if I could, because that time in my life, which I'm still like recently just gotten out of, was very scary and like so much uncertainty. And a big part of my fear, aside from just like imposter syndrome that LD was kind of mentioning, was kind of the fear of losing my identity as a white collared professional, because I've had a lot of blue collar jobs in the past. But you know, that ideal goal of like, oh, in the professional world, have this white collar job, a desk job or something. And knowing too that in the professional world, like asking myself, like, would that mean that I'd have to like assimilate to this white cisgendered male heteronormative standard? And that was kind of scary. And in the beginning of my job, I actually did. I feel like I was just hyper professional in what I thought what being a professional was. But now I know that it's not all just like suits and ties and you have to code switch. Like you can still be a professional and like have your black scent or just be who you are fully. Like you shouldn't have to lose that. And that's something that I'm still learning now. And a lot of what's helped me with that is just being in a space with coworkers who encourage me to fully be myself and be human. And it's not as easy as I would want it to be. Again, it's just kind of like a daily process, but it's definitely been in the works. And yeah, that's kind of the main thing I tell myself, that I could define what being a professional is, and it doesn't have to just be, mimicking what a white male professional is.
Yeah. Right. Before you say your next question, Ryan, I want to grab at a thread I've heard all of us kind of say in different forms, and see if I can like put it together a little bit. That we like when we're talking about this like job process and application process, and this is a very career oriented conversation. In finding your career, you're not just gonna walk in there and stop being the you that was at home an hour ago, and stop being like the you that likes playing video games or whoever that you is. So like going to a place that doesn't serve that version of yourself isn't going to work for you in the long term. And that's important to realize from the very beginning. Because me, I love joking. I think I don't know why I cannot help it, no matter what situation I'm in, no matter who I'm talking to. I was in a meeting with the like newly elected general counsel of McDonald's. Like this woman is the top dog. She's the first Black woman to hold the job in the company's history. It is the meeting. And I made fun of my coworker because he went to Arkansas. Like I couldn't help it. And it's just because of that's who I am. But they knew that about me before I got there, because in my interview, I was cracking jokes. And like not all of them are going to be funny. I know that. But I have to let them out or I'm not going to feel comfortable and I'm not going to give my best work. And like though we're having a career conversation, like remembering who you are and all the other versions of yourself, like pulling that blue collar worker thing, I agree with. I still bartend. And like I do need the money for different things, but I know I'm doing it more because I don't want to let go of that version of myself that was a blue collar worker, and that identity of like, look, I come here, I'm at work from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m, hustling, my feet hurt, my back hurt when I get home, because I don't want to just fully immerse myself into the white collar like workforce. And like that is an important part of your identity and it matters. And like you're not going to lose it. Well, you can lose it if you don't nurture it. So like making sure we're doing our best in this hiring process to nurture that identity and let it be still part of who you truly are.
Also, I just want to say too that right after graduating Loyola, I actually was a bartender and a server while I was like applying for my job. So I do get that, yeah. But yeah, you are not your job. Like even entering this career, like it's definitely like, can enhance your life or, become a barrier to who you really are. But you are no job title. You're beyond that just as a human. So.
And if you can't show up to work and be yourself, think about just the psychological pressure and emotional toll that takes on a person over time. And I think that's a lot of times where our conversation as career counselors can go with people who might be unhappy in a job.
I will say that looking back, there was always this pressure around it's like dating, right? Like it had to tick all the boxes to go like to the next level of curiosity. Like, do I even want to maintain interest in this place because it's missing a couple of boxes, right? And I have to tell you outright, I mean, when I graduated at 21, did I really know who the hell I was? Like in terms of where I am 30 years later. And like, I was not out. I was not, and yet I went into like a very homophobic, misogynistic industry called investment banking. But one could reframe that and say, well, it served my purpose of actually staying in the closet. And then I firmly believe a lot of that energy that was going to go there went into work and like me doing well and getting like it just found its way. But all this to say, you know what you know at the time that you're there, but you still don't know what's still ahead. So it's okay to feel like it only hits like 80% of what I want, right? Because actually what you're saying is it's only hitting 80% of what you know to be of who you are at that moment. And you're still unfolding. Like in that next job, you could be like, okay, I got really good litigation training here, but now I really want to get more into like, how does client relationship management look? And it feels like in that next level of my career, that's where I want to focus, right? Because I mean, Rodney, I don't know what the stats are, but what's the average number of jobs per person, like for this generation going on? Like, it's not 3.
The stats say 7, 5.
Okay, so imagine asking that first job, you're out of college or a master's degree to be the job. Like that's a lot of pressure, right? And so even to be respectful of and dance with that dynamic and be open to like time and perspective to say, I may not get fully everything here in terms of what my identity is, but at the same time, I certainly didn't know what my full identity was, and I'm still in the process of unfolding, right? And Ruby says it's a lifetime's work of unveiling yourself, like millions of veils that you put onto yourself, and that's how you get to identity. And if you think about a job, like you're trying to keep those veils on, like you don't want to seem low, like sort of like you don't know what you're doing, but really you're still walking into what you don't know. But I guess my last point is, if it feels like enough of you is going to be fulfilled and going to be held and formed in a really good professional way, then that's a good place too. And the good enough mantra, as opposed to like it has to be the best, it has to be this. But I remember looking back on it had to be the best. It was like, yeah, that was a little unforgiving on my part. And then life unfolds. So
Definitely. And the next question touches on the topic that we're still kind of focusing on. But as you think about imposter syndrome and how that might play out in the hiring process, how do you feel those elements of imposter syndrome have come up, whether it was around you going on the interview or feeling welcomed at the place that you worked, or even what you're seeking out professionally now for yourself next? How do you see this element of imposter syndrome playing out?
So I didn't really have that much imposter syndrome before, or like during my application process, but it really hit me once I was hired and doing the job. And I saw all of these people around me, like I was the only one without a master's degree and like all these things, and like the way that they presented themselves and they spoke, I'm like, wow, like, but also knowing that imposter syndrome, like they hired you, you're there obviously for a reason, but even knowing that, like you still have that little devil on your shoulder telling you otherwise, but also like you're there to learn too, and know that like everyone's going to make mistakes, or if you have questions, like always feel free to ask them. But in the way that it's really come up in my job is that actually a couple of weeks ago I brought it up to my supervisor. I was just like, hey, like I'm feeling these things. I just talked about it during my check-in, and I mean, he was my former supervisor now. He just moved to a different position. But at that time, 2 weeks ago, he was like our director. He's been in the field for like 20 plus years, like extremely eloquent. And then he told me, he's like, yeah, I feel like that like 2 to 3 times a week. And I was like, wow, like I thought that was a me thing, just being like an associate position, just like looking up at all these people and being so new to this whole professional world, and having like seeing this professional in front of me, like this full-blown professional, having also those feelings in his own way, was very reassuring. And then he told me, he's like, you have all the credentials you need to succeed. And that just hit me. And I was like, okay, if this person sees that in me, I obviously have to see that in myself. So affirmations, affirmations during work, after work, before work, whenever, just to remind yourself that, you're there and you're there. So might as well just take advantage of you being in that space. And you're there because people want to see you and help you succeed. So again, it's just reminding yourself. And if you, are going through a really, a dark period where you're just really questioning your role or anything, I hope that, someone would have at least someone else, like a coworker or a friend that they could like reach out to just to kind of express those feelings. Because also just like holding that in yourself can be a lot of times. And also the internet too, just Googling things, Reddit. There's a lot of information on there just to kind of know that you're not alone.
Paulina, that was the perfect answer. That was an amazing answer. Yeah. So for me, my imposter syndrome, it hit me hard early and it hit me often. I mean, like I said before, like going into the application process, like I didn't apply to certain places because I didn't think I was good enough or whatever. And especially in law too. So there's a thing within law called the T14, which are the top 14 schools in the country. And if you go to one of those, you basically can get any job you want anywhere. And if you don't go to one of those, you can't get any job you want anywhere. And you're expected to kind of just like, it's like fighting for a spot. So me, not being, if you're going to get one of those high jobs, you're usually one of the best students at your school. When I got this opportunity that I had with McDonald's and Proskauer, first of all, I thought it was fake because I was like, there's no way these people want me, right? Like it hit me early and it hit me often. And I continued to doubt myself, like throughout the process. I was like, they're eventually going to realize like they got the wrong one because I'm not at T14 and I'm not, at the top of my school at Tulane. I just kept thinking like, they're going to find out sometime that I'm not supposed to be here. But that never happened. I kept going to meetings and they would be like, LD, you did great work on this. Or they would be like, LD, you did great work and this is a way you can improve. Or LD, that was a really good question. And for some reason, I wasn't hearing that early. And I started tapping to program, like, that's a compliment. Like they're saying like, you deserve to be here. That's not the words they're using, but they're saying you deserve to be here and you need to take that in. And like Paulina said, it helped to ask about it. I was meeting people in very powerful places who had marginalized identities. And I would always ask, like, do you have imposter syndrome? And how does it affect you? How has it affected you? And they would be in this field for decades. And all of them would be like, yeah, I still get it sometimes. Like it doesn't go away all the way. And one of them gave me the best advice I think I got, which was, okay, you have imposter syndrome, right? Which means in your mind, you're thinking, I don't deserve to be here. That statement is either true or not, right? No matter that, we all know it's not true, but let's just say it can either be true or it's not true. If it is true, then you got to go into that space as a student, right? And if everyone in that room is actually smarter than you are or whatever, well, you're in the room now, so let's learn from them. And that's how we become as smart as the smartest people is like, oh, like you have a really different process than me. So tell me about your process. And if it works for you, like now you've picked up a new tool to make sure that you deserve to be in that space because you can do the things that the best can do. And then sometimes you walk into that room and you're like for me, the experience I had that kind of like made me question my imposter syndrome the most in terms of like getting rid of it or like bearing it and dealing with it was we did this like litigation training where we all put on a fake trial. And I was with students from Columbia and Brown and NYU, which are these like T14 schools. And I was expecting to get blown out of the water. Like I was like, I'm walking in the space, like they are going to like they're going to realize at some point that this guy, like we're going to have to carry him through this because he's not going to be able to keep up with us. I was the best one on my team because that's what I was good at. And that's what Proskauer saw in me from the beginning, that I have this experience, I can talk, I have the gift of gab, whatever. And it highlighted throughout that. And I was able to realize things, and my attention to detail was showing, and all these other skills that I had that meant I should be in the room was showing, despite me not having this identity that I thought I needed to have, or this whatever title that I thought I needed to have, because I don't need it. You have all the tools you need, you know? So if it's true, go learn from them. And if it's not, recognize the fact that you're a badass and do what badasses do.
Love it. Love it. I'm going to pull a little bit of the same theme, I think, as LD, which is I've always known that I was not the same, and that I looked different, that I spoke differently, that I appeared different. I came from different places. And so in the language of spirituality, it's sort of the other character, right? Like the other person. And in my life, I can say that I've sort of turned that a little bit enough to say, I'm going to use that energy of othered to fuel a little bit of my execution of life plans and inform me differently of how I do it, and use that to make other people see, oh, like this is another point of view. This actually works too. And so it's never been a question of like being co-opted into what it is, but sort of, I always like to be, I always want to remain on the outside. That's sort of my thing. And I think there's strength there. And that's a version of that's, imposter syndrome that comes from a place of, I'm different. It feels different, right? That it's okay, like because it is different, right? But how can you also turn it around so that can be a positive source of a motivation and energy for you? And then at the end of the day, you realize quickly that there's going to be strength in your ability to speak differently, to say differently, to have a different viewpoint. And if the place welcomes it, fantastic. And if it doesn't, then and you remember that, and you keep score inside, and that's part of how you move to job number 6 or job number 7 is you know these things, you keep track. Because at the end of the day, much like how we relate to as people, it's a really hard ask to ask people to change, right? A lot of the energy that we carry as people is, why can't you just do it the way I want you to do it? But I'm just being me. And the realization at some point that you're only going to keep beating yourself up by expecting something differently. And it's okay to go differently as well. And maybe you feel less like an imposter. Maybe you find more of a place there. But every moment of experience in those details of like job 3, job 4, job 5 is always building to something more rich.
Definitely. So I did have one final question prepared, but I wanted to open up the space just to find out if anyone wanted to ask a question of our panelists, just given some of the things that you've heard tonight or some of the things that you might be curious about.
I want to inject a little bit of an immigrant reality thing of money. When you don't have money, you want a little bit of money, and you want a little bit of money as a currency to do other things like pay your school debts and have home security, food security. And sometimes there's also tension, I think, it feels like a mutually exclusive thing where you might have to sacrifice something to be in a place where there's a little bit more of this. And, and the culture looks very different with money, right? The dominant culture looks very different with money. And so I'm just curious to ask the general question of, have people felt a tension between chasing that reality of what you want also as part of your career, and feeling like, well, more of me is being heard here, right? Like, I don't know how people have experiences with money and monetary rewards are, right? It's the same thing with like insurance. I mean, you know, you can go for a job with like full-time or no healthcare stuff, right? These are some of the things that come into play in that job. You get to a place where it's a great place, but they don't offer fucking insurance. Sorry. They don't they don't offer insurance. I need dental. I really need dental bag, right? I've got a $5,000, like I need. But you also know that, like, am I going to be able to stomach that? You know, like, these are some of the tensions of life that show up in some of these opportunities, and having the ability to say, it's okay to choose.
Are you asking the students or us? I'm sorry.
I'm asking everyone. Yeah, everyone.
I can start with my story actually. So I guess the only way I can really answer this question is to tell you a little bit about myself too, which is that like I started with, you know, I grew up poor Black and I'm born and raised in New Orleans. Getting into law school was a big deal for me. And when I came, my original idea was like, I want to be the next Brian Stevenson. I wanted like change the world one case at a time. Like I thought I was going to do criminal justice law and X, Y, and have like I had a very certain plan. And there's not a lot of money in that, and that didn't bother me. That wasn't a reason why I didn't do it. But what was a reason why I didn't do it was I would go to classes and I would have these experiences that made me physically hurt. Like academic, I couldn't stomach my criminal law classes because I had to do things in that class that like I couldn't do objectively because of my lived experiences. The way I explain this to someone is that when you go to a class like that, you're in that class in 3 different ways. You're a law student who has his own expectations. I'm a law student who has expectations of what a student must do. I'm a Black man who has expectations of like how to appear in this I'm like one of 3 Black men in this class of 75 students, right? Or one of 3 Black people in this class of 75 students. And then I am the subject of the case because, you know, what is it? 4 times out of 10, 6 times out of 10, when it should be 1 time out of 10, the defendant in a criminal law case is a Black man, you know, and there's all the issues with that. And I realized, like, I was like, I can't do this for the rest of my life. I can't do this for a year. I don't have it in me. And that was super hard, right? Because, you know, I had expectations of my career and who I was going to be as a person in X, Y, and Z. And when I realized that, I was like, all right, you know, you're still in law school. You still are going to get this degree. Like, you're not turning around just because you're not going to be the type of lawyer you thought you were going to be. Let's expand a little bit. And that's kind of how I ended up in labor and employment and litigation. Was I just started sending applications. And I was like, either they're going to take it or they're not, but I'll get a summer job somewhere and I'll try it. And if I like it, I like it. And if I don't, you know, I have another summer to find something. And it wasn't until I was interviewing with one of the firms that ended up being like in the program that I ended up doing, did I find out how much attorneys can make. The starting salary for the position that I'm eventually going to take is $205,000. For most of my life, my mother didn't make a fifth of that. And I remember after learning, and like that was a really big thing for me that I had to process in an interview, was being told how much the starting salary was and having to be like it like shocked me to my core. And like, I don't have the financial maturity or XYZ maturity to like even understand how much money that is, right? And like, I know like now I've learned more, like it is a lot of money, but it's not like, you know, it's not millions or whatever, but it is a lot of money. And it was a shock to me. And then there started coming to questions with it, like during corporate litigation law, you're representing the employers. And I was like, oh my God, like this is a great opportunity. There's a lot of money in this. I'm a sellout. Like if I want this opportunity, I had to process. I was like, I think it feels like I'm selling out. And when I ended up getting there, and I remember like another part of that was like I can take care of like my nephews and my like kids, and like I remember like skipping meals and bouncing from house to house as a kid. Like you're telling me my kids won't have to do that? Like I felt like I had to choose, like you said, like, and I asked straight up. I started my job and I went to the, like I said, the managing partner. He's my mentor at Proscour. Black man, I was like, how do you, I didn't say sell out per se, and I think he actually said the word. I was like, how do you deal with, like dealing with, like we're doing employment discrimination law. How do you deal with that? And he was like, oh, you're asking how I deal with, feeling like a sellout. I was like, yeah. How do you deal with that? Like, do you feel like you're selling out? And he explained it in a way that made sense to me was, I do have to decide cases and I do have a client. And like there's an inherent part of that where like sometimes you're gonna have to decide a case, you're gonna have to work a case that goes against some of your identities, which is hard in of itself and difficult in of itself. And sometimes it's true, and you can get and you push the firm to the corporation to settle and don't drag it on, and you make sure that person like is taken care of because their claims are true, and sometimes it's not, and you end up fighting something and it feels bad, or it feels weird. But what he told me is you can also go in, because I'm in this room and because I'm their lawyer, I can also go into rooms and tell people, look, you need to fire this guy. Like he might not expose you to legal liability, but this is a bad man and he is not helping your firm, and he's not creating the workplace that is diverse and inclusive, and the stories will get written. Whether or not you win the case, the stories are going to get written. Get him out of here, and they'll fire him. And I was like, okay, like that was my balance, like I might not be fighting this on a person by person nature, and I am sacrificing in a way. Like there are gonna be times where like I'm gonna have to fight against what I feel like are my interests and feel like a sellout, to be frank. But then I can also affect real change, and I can change the way a company works, and I can get people out who are hurting like employees because they don't need to be in those jobs. And then I can also take care of my family.
Yes.
Yes. Which is important. And there's no saying and I also don't have to do this forever. Like if I get there and I start working this and I can have this reasoning for 3 years, and if my 4th year, if I'm like, that reasoning is BS, it's not working, I am not that, I can move on.
Yes. And
I can do something else.
Wow, that is really good reasoning, and thank you for sharing that story. Yeah, that's pretty incredible to hear. And yeah, as for like my upbringing, definitely like family struggled with money. Like that was a main source of tension, like every day, just growing up in that environment. But when it came time to kind of like choose my major, because, at that time I was like, okay, this will kind of start to determine like how much money I'll make in my life, even though it's not that deep. And a lot of times like major doesn't even determine career. And I know that now, but, at, the time when I was deciding on what to study, I knew that I didn't want money to be the motivating factor. And now that I work at a nonprofit, I could see that carried through. Like I definitely make enough, and I'm like really happy with what I make. But yeah, for me, money definitely is just a means to an end and not the end itself. And I don't really care about chasing money. That's kind of the way that I choose to rebel. But definitely like I try to like just have the mindset that like money will come and find me, and it has. So it's worked out in that way so far. But definitely being very responsible with the amount of money that I have. And like my mom always taught me to like, she'll make $1 into 2, like really, really stretch a penny. So kind of carrying that out. But yeah, that's kind of been my mindset with like money in terms of career so far. And that's might change, who knows, but that's me now.
Excellent. So my final question for you all, as you're thinking about an organization that you've worked at or places that you were evaluating to go work for, how can you tell if a company is being truthful or authentic around their mission and goals as it relates to diversity and inclusion? And how do you know if they're not following through on their promises, and if maybe there's red flags there that you may want to be aware of?
I think there's three things, right? One, first of all, it's really hard to tell. At the interview level, it is really difficult to tell. There's definitely ways you can check and double check, and then you can get there and find out, it may or may not be the case. So the first thing I'm going to say is, if you go to a place and it's hard to tell, like, how much are they going to actually stick with the DEI that they claim to be, that they claim during the interview process, is you talk to the associates who are on the way out. For me, that was my experience. Is I reached out to an associate who I was in the same group, and it started as a working relationship. And then they explained to me, they were like, hey, I'm not going to be here much longer. Like, I'm fine. It's not the firm. I just, I've gotten what I need to get out of this experience, and I'm ready for my next chapter. And that's the first person you need to talk to. You go to them because they have nothing to lose. They don't have to worry about whether or not, losing a new associate is going to affect their ability to go up. And you ask them straight up, because they identified as non-binary. They were a queer person. And I was like, how do you feel about your treatment here? And they gave me the truth. And there were some things that were really good, and there were some ways that they were trending in the right directions. And there were times that that the firm wasn't doing what they claimed to be doing. And the firm needed to figure things out and needed to work on these things. And I felt like I got an honest answer from them, and I then was able to decide whether or not that was something I was okay with having to deal with. Sorry, my dogs like to wrestle. I don't know if you can hear them or not. And then, but that's the first one. I would say, if we backed up a little bit and went back to the interviews, is we've heard people in groups on various different platforms talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. Really listen to what the person who's interviewing you is saying, and does it sound like what you've heard before? Like, is their answer unique in any way? And if it's not, then in my mind, what I'm hearing is, you're coached up to say this. I don't want someone who's coached to be inclusive. I want someone who is inclusive. So if you're hearing that same thing over and over and over again, we at blah, 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 really pride ourselves on diversity, equity, inclusion. We think that every person deserves to be seen. And tell me you haven't heard this exact sentence before. And if you're hearing it, it's like, I don't know if this firm is going to hold it up once I get there, because they can't. They're not holding it up now. They're just saying what they've been taught to say. And I forgot my third one, and that's okay, because those two will be good enough for now.
Yeah, as LD was saying, it's really hard to tell in the interview stage or before then, if they're actually upholding it. And the only way that I've really determined whether or not an organization is holding it or not is just by working there and firsthand. For example, I worked at a factory a couple years ago, and then, microaggressions would happen, sexual harassment to a lot of the women there. And, you'd go to the management team and the owners, and then them just nodding their heads, being okay, hearing you, and then doing nothing about it, not talking to the perpetrators or anyone. And then that's the most obvious example of, not upholding this inclusive environment in regards to gender and sexuality. But yeah, very obvious example. But in a way that that it is being upheld, because any place could say that they uphold JEDI or justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And that means that they either do or they don't. But once you're there, a really good way just determining that they do is just seeing how they go about it without talking about it, if that makes sense. So it's one thing to say oh yeah, we uphold DEI and stuff. It's okay, walk that talk, really show me without telling me. And the example that I have in my current job is that we do a lot of work with community-based organizations. So in the law field, I'm not an urban planner, but I work with a lot of urban planners, and urban planning has just this really gross history of just racial discrimination. It's so bad. But in a way to kind of fix that, it's okay, instead of having all these white cisgendered men, planning a city or trying to determine what is best for this community, how about And it's not even that radical of a thought. Like, how about those community members themselves? Give them that power, like shift that dynamic, and let them not only have a say, but a voice, and like having them like complete the action. So yeah, it's like working with community-based organizations, you know, in like the Southwest and south sides of Chicago. And like it's seeing that, you know, and being on a Zoom call with like the head of the Southeast Environmental Task Force, like working directly with environmental justice organizations. Like that's an obvious way that you know that that's happening. And then also, you know, organizing community meetings and events and hearings. Again, just an obvious example of like seeing that actually happen rather than people just telling you that it's happening.
Sorry, well, I want to answer Tatum's question just so. So for me, I think the easiest way to figure out whether or not someone is leaving is one, establishing relationships. You'll find out who very quickly, like once you start working with people, who's on their way out. A lot of times you can tell too by who's not coming to the social events and things like that, because if you're not going to be there much longer, you don't care about making friends anymore. And while you might not be able to just like go up to someone and be like, hey, are you about to quit? You can, you know, just start working with people and start like be like ask some questions about their career and like where do they see themselves going, and eventually they'll open up and be like, you know, like I've been here for X amount of years, I plan on being here for X amount of more years, or I've been here for X months and I think I'm going to make a career change in, you know, a couple more months or something like that. And that's when you can be like, are you open to having a more, you can say authentic, I can say real, like a brutal, I usually use brutally honest. Are you willing to have a more brutally honest conversation about like the firm? It's difficult to gauge, but the first step is just getting to know people and getting to know like where their goals are and where they might be heading in the near future.
I just wanted to inject some thoughts around DEI in my workplace. I remember when I first spoke to the founder of our practice and hearing some of the things, the groups that they've got, processing therapy groups. And then when I heard that one of them, he's been running for like 20, 25 years himself, you know, to help accompany, you know, certain marginalized populations. To me, that spoke volumes that even at that level, the top of the food chain in terms of leadership is still very much in the, you know, grassroots level of, you know, making, you know, showing up and working, and to sort of Paulina's point around, you know, walking the walk a little bit. So that speaks volumes when it's also being done at what level by whom, right? Because the commitment is there, and role modeling is very important, right? So if you're not going to see it at all from the top, and it's only going to be sort of a paid position by certain people below, then, you know, that feels very different. Yeah, that's what I would say about that.
All right. And those are all of the questions that I have for the group tonight. Does anyone else have any questions at all about any of the themes that we touched on tonight, or some of the things that you might be wondering about? All right, so I did want to just put in a plug for our future events. We do have 2 other panels that are going to be coming up on February 8th at 5 o'clock, creating cultural capital, networking with a purpose. And then on Monday, February 21st, we are going to be doing a panel on owning and communicating your value, how to negotiate your salary. And then we also have the Diversity and Inclusion Career Fair, the first annual one that we're ever doing, on Wednesday, February 23rd at 3 o'clock. So that is going to be on Zoom. All of these events are going to be taking place on Zoom. So again, I just wanted to take the time to thank our panelists tonight. We really do appreciate your support and being able to put something like this together. I'm really grateful.
Thank you, Rodney. Pleasure to meet everyone.
Yeah, this is a really great conversation. Thank you everyone for listening.
Very, very excited for you all. That's awesome. Good stuff.
Thank you, all for
Thank
your
you
time.
so much.
If you ever want to reach out to us with any, I'm going to speak for Paulina and Lolan too. But if you ever want to reach out to us with any questions, no, I give up. Do it.
Yeah, I'm just sending out my email. So any questions about anything, feel free.
Great. All right, everyone. Have a great night and a great rest of the week too.
God bless. Be safe, everyone. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.